welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Welcome to Syosset Library's Turn the Page podcast. I am your host, Jessica. I'm here with my amazing co-host. Would you like to introduce yourself, co-host?
Hi, I'm Jen.
And our guest today is Kelly Lundquist, and she wrote a memoir of a marriage called Beard, which why don't you describe it to us first, Kelly, and then we can really just dive in to your story as a whole and um, how how this became the moment when it was published.
Yes, so many good questions within even that question. So I grew up conservative evangelical in Mississippi. That's where I was born and raised. And the summer that I was 19 years old, I met someone at a Christian summer camp who I immediately bonded with. We immediately became best friends. He and I stayed up until 5 o'clock in the morning, like the third night that we knew each other, just talking and talking and talking, like could not run out of, just didn't run out of conversations for that whole summer. And eventually he and I started dating. We got married. Over the course of that marriage, I in particular started to sort of deconstruct from the faith tradition that we had grown up in, largely because of my academic studies. And over the course of that deconstruction, we moved to Chicago to a neighborhood called Boys Town, which is now kind of more known as North Halsted, but it's kind of a historically queer neighborhood in Chicago. And over the course of the marriage as well, sort of parallel with that, my ex-husband, I found out more and more and more about the way that he had grown up, and I found out that he had essentially spent his whole adolescence in conversion therapy. And in fact, one of the people that he had therapy with later became kind of the head of that form of therapy at Oral Roberts University in Tulsa, Oklahoma. So that's a whole situation. But slowly that kind of became apparent in our marriage. It became apparent that he had been sleeping around a little bit, kind of trying to just kind of come to terms with that. And every time he would feel awful and, all of this would happen. But so a lot of that kind of came to light in the period of time we were in Chicago. And then once I began my PhD there, I became acquainted with a gay man named Nick, who remains one of my best friends. And so over the course of that time that I was studying masculinity, like that was my dissertation was on Walt Whitman's Bowery masculinity. That's the neighborhood, as you all know better than I do, in New York, that he was a part of. And so I had this group of, Nick and his friends who kind of became my closest friends at that time. And so I was, ostensibly getting a PhD in masculinity, getting a PhD in queer theory, studying this, in a very academic way as I'm kind of slowly not realizing the extent to which my husband is, eventually like falling in love with someone else, falling in love with the man that he worked with. And so there's some levels of like tragicomic irony that even at the time, I think there was a part of me that was sort of like clocking like, okay, this is this is a lot. And then the night before he got outed to me was Halloween in Boys Town, and I was dressed as Liza Minnelli for this Halloween on Halsted parade, which is this big annual tradition. And so there were just a lot of layers of it that felt, even at the time, like, okay, this just feels like cinematic in a way. And so we ended up getting divorced, and it ended in a really beautiful way. And I think, honestly, more than anything else, that was what prompted me to want to write about that experience. And so what I tried to do with the book is to essentially take our story and have that be kind of the skeletal like structure of the book, while also kind of bringing in some of these like cultural studies, techniques and tropes and things like that. I watched like way too many sitcoms. And so I knew that like I wanted some of that to be a component of it, as well as like old Hollywood. One of my favorite podcasts is You Must Remember This, the Karina Longworth podcast about old Hollywood. And so I wanted to kind of delve into some of those pieces and weave them in to the story as well. So that's pretty much what the book is about. Hopefully that explains a little bit about it, but yeah.
I think like there's a lot in it. And one of the things that keeps on coming up, aside from you know, you kind of very slowly spooling away from the very rigid thinking. There's a few themes that I found reoccurring. Number one was it did seem like even if the love wasn't the love that you would
Mhm.
want with your spouse, that you and your ex really did feel very deeply for each other.
Mhm.
And that there was sort of that piece of connection that it was like, okay, if we do really feel very deeply for each other, why can't this one thing not be an issue?
Absolutely, yeah. And I think like, so much of that is culturally conditioned. And I think it's like from multiple places. I don't just think it was kind of from either the like geographical context we came from, because he was also from the South, or, the sort of like religious context. I think it's just also like you're kind of grown to expect that if you have this like deep connection with someone, that it has to sort of ultimately lead to romantic connection. And I think, even the movies in the 90s that I loved often had that, like I've been, looking around and now I found you and you've been here all the time, my best friend, my platonic best friend is now my love, like that sort of like theme reoccurring. So I think it was kind of coming in from everywhere that's sort of like that's how you do this. And I think there was also a piece where one of the pieces of advice that we were given frequently by multiple people when we were trying to decide if we would get married was, well, can you imagine life without the other person? And we were both like, no, absolutely not. Like that, I can't imagine that. And so there were all these things that sort of made sense, but also, obviously, like in the light of hindsight, maybe were less than wise choices we could have made. And actually, he and I actually have become pretty close over the last few years. Like I've joked a couple times in the last week that for a long time I was like the girl who cried book because I would reach out to him periodically and be like, hey, are you still okay if I write about this? Like I'm still kind of writing about it. And he'd be like, yeah, sure, whatever, sure. And then eventually, like 3 years ago, I was like, I think this is actually going to be a book now. Like I think we're actually going to have a thing that's coming out. And are you okay with that? And so, about 3 or 4 years ago, we started to talk much more frequently than we had been. I mean, we always kind of kept in touch, but we weren't like talking a lot. And now he and I talk like fairly frequently. We just had brunch like a month ago. Like, we're in a really good place. But all that to say, one of the conversations that he and I have had is sort of looking back and saying, would it have been better if we had known that it was okay for us just to be friends? Like, would we have not had to lose like 15 years of knowing each other well, in order to like have this be the case? And for both of us, it's a hard thing to answer because it's always hard to imagine what your life would have been like had you like turned a different corner. And for both of us, that was such a formative experience. And honestly, that for me, probably more than any other experience I've had, transformed me, like really, shaped who I have become in a way that was really profound. And so, yeah, it's hard to say, right? You don't want to praise suffering as if it's like necessary. But you also want to say, like, yeah, but I don't know that I don't know who I would be had I not had that experience. Like, I just can't imagine who I would have become. So, yeah, that's a great question. I think it's it's hard. It's hard to, figure out what that could have looked like had we made other choices.
It made me think a lot about how much this sort of like the supremacy of romantic love as a
Mm,
concept, how much pressure that puts on friendships as you've been
mm,
talking about. And then when you add the religious factor of
mhm.
like not only is romantic love supreme, but it is the reason that you were put on this earth and it is your duty to God.
Yep.
Like that constrains all sorts of relationships in a lot of really difficult ways.
Mm, absolutely. Yeah, when you try to kind of like factor in like all of the different pieces, yeah, for sure. I mean, and oh my gosh, like, I think a whole other piece of this is unpacking gender, as well, like how that, certainly I feel like I have a complicated relationship to gender at this point in my life. But yeah, I mean, unpacking what the immediate expectations of, how you present and how you are believed, who you are believed to be in the world and what that's for. And certainly with women in the church, especially, that was very much like there was very, kind of a linear thing. And one of the analogies that I make kind of early on in the book is that have always been compared to Judy Garland, not like by people out in the world, but just like by the few people who've known me, and that has been like, oh, and you can look at certain pictures of me and be like, oh my God, that's uncanny, and of course, like it's a, coincidental resemblance. But one of the things that I wanted to kind of like emphasize by pulling that out a little bit was that, I grew up a theater kid too, like simultaneous with being kind of a church kid, and that both of those roads for me sort of emphasized like you can be this type of character. Like you have to be, if you're going to look like this, then you have to be this type of character. And if you're going to look like this, then you have to be this, and so I felt like in both senses of that constraining, like I was sort of like, here's the road, And it's hard when you're 19 years old and you don't know, you just don't know what you don't know. And you kind of just like follow the road, But yeah, that's a great point.
I think we're probably peers, by the way, because when you are describing certain things like like my freshman year was the year that South Park came out, for instance. And a few other things. I want to talk a little bit just about like your relationship with body image, because I think it
Oh
flows
yeah.
very well from what you were talking about. And it really resonated with me because I
Mm,
absolutely withheld food from myself and you know like it fit very well into my version of OCD. Like people often consider OCD, cleanliness. If you've seen my office, that is not how it works for me. Jen knows this because she's literally next door and she's like, yeah. But like if you're already predisposed to that type
mm,
thinking that you could kind of,
mm,
and you have body image issues, withholding food, counting calories,
mm,
measuring what your, like what pants you fit into,
mm,
it all fits in very well. And that really resonated with me because it brought me back. I was going through that at the same time. And I there is that whole like, yes, you have to be this particular type of character, but at the
mm.
same time, like you had to be Kate Moss. You
Yeah.
had a
Right?
negative
Yeah.
stomach during that point in time, or else guys just weren't going to be into you.
Yes.
Um, so, it was like very much like I felt that, like Devin was very much this ideal.
Mm,
And in order for the goal to be met, aside from the fact that you had this emotional connection, you had to fit into that other role as far as what you
yeah.
what you looked like, and gaining
Mm,
weight is a failure. And like having not grown up in necessarily a religious background, that was still like very, very much a part of my formative years, like
mm,
somebody saying you don't need to eat that, somebody,
yeah.
um but I did really appreciate that in general. When may I ask, when you look back at that piece
Mm,
and like that, if this, then like things are going to work out with me and Devin, and I'm going to be
mm,
like the leading lady of a Meg Ryan movie.
yeah.
Um, is it difficult to remember your mindset back then, remember your voice back then?
I love that question so much. Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's interesting. Like, people's reactions to some of the body stuff have been, it's been interesting. I've had, mixed responses, and that's fine, whatever. But one of the impulses people have is to come up to me, the 48-year-old, woman, and be like, "You're so pretty, baby." They're like, "Oh, honey, like, and I'm like, I'm trying to kind of like say who I was at, 19, 20 years old. Like this is not, I'm not there anymore, thank goodness. And I can write about it because I'm not there anymore. And obviously like that stuff stays with you. Like it's not gone, from my head, but I've certainly found some ways to deal with it and some healthier ways to deal with those voices when they kind of come up in my head. But, I think with that, one of the things that really kind of came alive to me, I did a million drafts of this book over the last 20 years. And, it really kind of came unlocked around 2021, 2022, when I realized that for me, on some level, this is a book about learning to read, learning to read, and the ways that we kind of impose meaning on bodies, and learn to read a body. And so I was trying to kind of make this analogy where I was trying to make my body translatable, in a certain way. Like I was trying to kind of like make this. And I think another sort of parallel idea for me was this idea of conversion more broadly. Like conversion therapy, I think is it's such a fraught term for so many reasons. But the idea of conversion, if you kind of like pull back on a more macro scale, is just like transforming one substance into another substance, and there's a kind of part of what I wanted to capture there. Like there's a great line, Mary Carr in The Art of Memoir has this great line, like show yourself wanting something dumb, right? That's like one of her best pieces of advice, I think. But one of the things that I wanted to kind of capture there is there was a kind of hopefulness for both of us, like both of us were sort of like, you're going to, transmogrify me into this like higher state of being where I will find purpose, meaning, belonging, like all of those things. And I think that while his certainly, I think there was some stuff layered onto his that maybe I did not have. Um, I think that for both of us, we had our very particular, very, compulsive, like very obsessive ways of trying to kind of like maintain that, that were damaging in different ways, and to different extents, but I think that, that to me was kind of the connection, the connective tissue there. And that really did unlock a lot for me. I tried actually have a chapter that I was trying really hard to make work. I was trying, and then some of them like just kind of came alive and some of them just never quite did. And I had this chapter that is not in the book, but was trying to kind of like link up Jane Eyre with Walt Whitman because both the character of Jane Eyre and Walt Whitman, the person, were into like phrenology and physiognomy and the ways that you kind of like read a skull for, the person's moral character and all of that. And I was trying to kind of do something with that. And maybe I will eventually, kind of come back to that and find a way to kind of like, bring it to life or whatever. But that was something that I was trying to kind of like wrestle and shoehorn into the book pretty deliberately. Just the ways that we sort of, and that, every year, right? Every New Year's resolution, there's a little bit of having that, if we sort of assign some sort of specific purpose like that, there's a little bit of like fresh purpose and it maybe only lasts a few weeks, but there's something a little hopeful in that, And so I wanted to kind of capture the sense. I wanted people who read it to be a little bit hopeful that it would work out for us. Even if you knew from the beginning it doesn't, like I wanted there just to be a little part of you that's like, oh, I hope those kids can figure it out, because I feel that, even like rereading it, right, and knowing how like much happier he and I both are, in these iterations of our lives, I wanted that to be a component of it.
I'm so glad that you brought up Walt Whitman because I am so curious about the intersections between your personal memoir aspects that you include here and the gender theory, the masculinity studies that you bring, and the dissection and deconstruction of these tropes of the beard. In terms of like applying the lens of your academic work to your life, I'm curious, like it's clear from like the book all of the insights that like your research gave you into like your own life experience. Was there that kind of, did that happen in the reverse? Like has the process of viewing your own life that way inflected your research at all?
I love it. I keep telling you that I love your questions, but I do. It's deeply genuine. This is like delightful. Yeah, it's interesting. Like when around one thing that isn't stated overtly in the book, but was also happening is that my ex-husband and I both loved This American Life. And that had kind of like a little bit dovetailed, the sort of origins of that had sort of dovetailed with our relationship. And for me, that was really my first exposure to creative nonfiction. That and like Anne Lamott, who one of my professors loved, and Annie Dillard. I kind of had these like little pieces of glimpsing this thing that was like, okay, you're talking about yourself, but you're also talking about science or a frog or, a moth, whatever this other thing is. And it's like Sarah Vowell, who I still just adore, David Sedaris, like all those writers, I was like, oh, this is interesting. And I think, that, from the moment I knew that that existed, I was like, whatever I do with writing, I want it to be that. Like, I want to find a way to do that. And part of why I was drawn to Loyola is my professor, Chris, who ended up being my dissertation advisor for a minute. Um, he wrote like that. Like, even his academic writing, his like, strictly academic writing still had elements of his personal life. And that was really like radical at the time, to do that, to like incorporate your personal experience, because that was very like poo-pooed in the academic writing that I had, come to know before I met him. Um, and so that was like, that was one of the appeals of that time and that type of writing. I've always joked that this is like an ongoing joke that I have, that I'm a writer with Maggie Nelson aspirations and a Hallmark Channel skill set. But like part of what I want, like I read the Argonauts in 2016 and my mind was just like, and I was like, oh, that's what I want to do, and the sort of broad term often applied to her work is auto theory. So it's this autobiographical literary theory. And I was just like, yes, amen. Like, let's do that, because a lot of how I understand myself is through media, is through literature, is through theory, is through philosophy and, media, generally. And so it just felt very natural that if I was going to try to tell the story of my life, I would also have to try to tell the story of those pieces of my life, because that, the coming to understand for me is kind of the narrative arc of the book to some extent. And I had a really hard time because, one of the main things you have to do in any book, right, is to have there be action and have something be happening and have it not just be there is a person sitting in a classroom hearing a thing that's going to change who they are, but all they're doing in that scene is literally just listening to a person talk and thinking new things, And I was like, I don't know how to make that a dramatic scene, And I had to kind of like condense some of those bits, because at one point I had like 5 or 6 different moments that were very similar to that. And so I cut it down to 3. But it was hard, it was tricky to kind of figure out how do you show someone falling in love with Walt Whitman and show that actually changing like their, neurological like, structure, um and have that be something that like is an action, on a page. And so yeah, that was a tricky thing to figure out how to do, and I still feel like I'm figuring it out. But it was really fun. It was a fun challenge, and it made the whole story feel much more alive to me, to have that be the challenge rather than just like, how do I tell this story that I've told a million times to a million different ways, so yeah.
How has, I mean, it's not out in the world just yet, right? Uh,
Yes, so October 30th is and then
so
that's very intentional. My
but
editor wanted it to be Halloween
that
because
does
it
that
lines
does
up.
make a lot of, yeah, that does make a lot of sense. But for those who have read it, have
Mhm.
people from your community of the past, who knew
Mhm.
you and Devin when you'd met, et cetera,
Mhm.
read it, and how has the reception been?
Honestly, so far, really positive. I'm sure, I've been through a million writing workshops, and it has been for some people and really not for other people. And I get that and I respect that, and that's the case. So I mean, I know that it's not going to be like uniformly positive. It's been an interesting, I think for a long time for me, even after, I'm divorced and my life kind of changed, and I, stopped going to church the way that I used to, and, all of that sort of changed. I still, I think up until about 2014, 2015, would try to kind of keep in touch with friends who were still kind of in a different place than I was, religiously or politically. And then that sort of just, ceased to feel as comfortable. And that's a whole other conversation. But so there are people who I've already kind of lost along the way because we're just really not in the same place. And that has become increasingly hard to just sort of like, figure out how to coexist. And that doesn't mean that I don't like care about those people or anything, but it's just, it's a more complicated thing now, I think, to do that. So all that to say, like, as a result of that, I think by and large, the people who are reading it, who are still, in my life from that time, are people who are kind of more or less going to be, you know, coming from a similar place. Um, and You know, I think that one of the things that meant more to me than I even expected that it would is, before we could sign the final contract on the book and like have it actually, sort of set, I had to get a liability waiver from Devin, my ex-husband. And the way that the liability waiver was phrased, it was like, I feel that I had been represented fairly in these pages, and he signed it immediately. And I was just like, there was something that kind of just made me come undone a little, from that, because I just felt like, it's not a universally positive depiction of him, and it's a depiction of him in a really hard time in his life, and so I have thought from the beginning that it's super brave of him to be willing to have me include even pieces of his story, because I knew that I wanted it to be my story. I wanted it to focus on me, but like none of us can tell a story that has no other people's stories in it, because it just doesn't make sense. Like we don't make sense outside of the context of other people's lives. And so I knew that there was going to be a portion of his story that I would have to tell in order for mine to kind of make any sense. But I wanted to be really careful how I did that. And so, I think there are people probably who are going to assume the worst about how that, came out, or feel that I didn't do that well. And people can, think what they want. And I appreciate, I appreciate that. But I tried to be really careful about how I shared his story and how honestly I shared my own, and implicated myself and the things that were harder about his life. And um but yeah, I mean, I think for the most part people have been more positive. And honestly, like I wish I had known that it would be like that, because I think I would have written the book more quickly. Because one of the things that slowed me down was like, oh my God, what if my mom reads this? What if and my parents have been incredibly supportive. They loved the book. They like both immediately like read it when it, the final version was finished this summer, and sent me lovely, notes about how much it meant to them. And um, so I think it's been less dicey than I was than I was afraid it was going to be, which is great.
Just really quickly to add on to that, and then I'll let Jen go. I do wonder how many people will see themselves though in both of your situations. Because it does seem like, certain societies that are very insular, and you hear about it
Yeah.
all the time when somebody has their, what is it, the record scratch moment where you're like, wait a
Yeah.
second. I do wonder, because I would imagine it would be very helpful to feel like you're not alone in this, and
Mhm.
hey, this is something that's been going on, and it's an experience, because it's very easy, I think, to fall into just that general feeling of like humiliation, like, oh my
Oh,
goodness, like,
absolutely.
and I think,
Mhm.
either people who have not recognized yet, or they do and they're putting their blinders on, or people who are
Mhm.
just like, of course this would happen to me, might read it and be like, well, yeah, and there's a whole system that was set up for this to
Mhm.
happen, and that's why.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think that's, I don't think that I did this from a defense. Like, I don't think that these portions of the story were like defensively done. Um, but I think there was a part of me that just wanted to complicate the narrative, because I would still like, as of even like a couple years ago, people would say stuff to me like, you had to know, like when you guys weren't having sex, you didn't figure it out. And I was like, we had sex. Like, I don't, I don't know how you like there. Yes, I didn't know. And that's true, and that absolutely. And it is very largely because of the, upbringing that I had and all of that, and what he was trying to kind of keep hidden from me, and all of that, what he was keeping hidden from himself, like, um, and so, yeah, and my friend Chris Studman, who's going to be one of my like conversation partners when I have a few different book events, who's a brilliant writer himself. Like one of the things that he has said a few times when we've been talking about the story of the book is, that, we may not have had this specific experience, but we've all had an experience where we didn't know something. We've all had an experience where what we thought was happening was not at all what was happening, and then been kind of blindsided by that. And so even if it's just that, I think everybody's had some experience where, yeah, if you look at it in one sense, it's very humiliating. It's very, it's like, oh my God, like how did I not see this? Um, but but yeah, so I think there is, and certainly like with this specific situation, I have had people come out of the woodwork all ready to be like, oh my God, this happened to me too, like, and I think what's lovely about that is that almost universally the people have stayed in touch and it's been this really redemptive thing, in many cases, right? Not universally, not everybody, right, has had a positive experience, um, but I've seen a lot of like tenderness and grace around those stories that I think is really lovely. And there is, it does sort of kind of make a little bit of a community, around that. Um, so yeah, I love that. Yeah, that's a definite.
I love the kind of overlaps between these ideas of like breaking down tropes and like complicating binaries and borders and boundaries between ideas and the sort of elements of like deconstructing yourself from a religion too and like breaking down ideas that you have like accepted your whole life. And one of the things I think the book does really nicely is that you do obviously like engage with all the tropes of the beard and all that and like constructions of like women in marriages. But I think, yeah, to your point that like tropes of divorce are sort of complicated here too, as a product of like parents who have a very tropey, a very tropey straight divorce. It's nice to see alternate models.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that was, I mean, even like if you think like, etymologically about construct, right? I mean, it's like building, like it's, and so it's sort of like literally like unbuilding, like taking something, and I mean, and I think there is if you are a person who's drawn to like writing about literature or, and studying it in that academic way, like there is a part of you that's always kind of like looking for patterns and connections and like where these things coalesce and, what is the sort of abstract connection point for these things. And so it became fun for me when I started to, it wasn't even just an issue of like, I want to, which is a very like noble way to think about what I did, in terms of like complicating things. And I tried to, I really did. But I think another part of it was just like, ooh, now this is interesting, like, ooh, because like this character was sort of this character and this character was sort of this character. And I knew that because like movies like Far From Heaven and there's musicals like the falsettos like Angels in America, like all of those stories, like they're hilarious and also tragic and all of that, and I love especially Angels in America is very, very important to me. But there is this trope of kind of the tragic gay man, and I wanted to play with that too because I feel like there are these interrelated tropes that occur. There's the gay villain, there's the gay, the gay best friend, and so there's a danger at every point when I would sort of like introduce those characters, those real people into my story, that they would sort of fall into that lane if I didn't tell it right. And I wanted to be really careful about that, but I also wanted to kind of like point out, like, yeah, if we tell this story in this way, here's this, this person. And to some extent, I wanted to play with that. Like there's a scene where I write about a man who gave me a terrible haircut. And I write about him as the gay villain, at the end of my story. Jokingly, of course, tongue in cheek. But yeah, I think tropes was where for me there was suddenly like a kind of like, oh, okay, like now I actually want to sit down and write versus like some of the stuff like, to return to an earlier topic, like the body stuff, which was hard to write and was hard to re-enter and was very much that kind of like mining this old hurt, and pushing on a wound and, that kind of stuff. That was more a little bit academic and a little bit detached. It was like, ooh, okay, now let's play with this. So I think there was something that felt kind of joyful and playful to me in unpacking things in that way too, that I don't know that I expected that.
Well, this has been really great conversation. Jen, do you have any other questions?
I think I'm good. This has been absolutely lovely. Thank you.
Thank you. This has been a delight. I just, yeah, yeah. I've been listening to y'all's podcast ever since you signed me up, but it's been a
Yay!
delight to listen to too. So
That's awesome.
I'm glad that this is a new gift in my life for sure.
Oh, that's excellent. Wow. Well, thanks. This was Jessica with Syosset Libraries Turn the Page podcast. My co-host is
Jen?
still
Jen.
is Jen.
Hi.
And our guest was
Kelly Lundquist.
yes. And we are going to close this chapter of Turn the Page.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.